On tonight's episode of Mr. Norris's In Case You Missed It, we take an overarching look at the presidency of George Washington. What were some of the precedents that he set and some of the difficulties that he had to go through? Nope. Hey, hello, hi, and what is up, everybody? It's your host, Mr. Norris, the history teacher with the good hair. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of my favorites, George Washington, G-Dub, son. But we're going to be talking about his presidency. Now, I want to preface this before we begin our video. This is going to be a very overarching video about George Washington's presidency. I'm not going to dive into every little single event that took place because, as you know, I do this for sixth graders, so we don't need to. It's not AP, senior history or whatever. So I'm going to give an overarching view here. I will say, though, if you would like a book recommended to you to read on George Washington's, just basically his whole life and his presidency, I recommend Washington, the Indispensable Man by James Thomas Flexner. Read it this past summer, and really, really good book. Bit of a long read, but it really dives into everything that happened with George Washington. So when we last left off with our last video, we were talking about the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution being written, delegates signing it, and then it being sent out to the states for ratification. Now, full ratification for the Constitution didn't take place until they adapted the Bill of Rights into the Constitution, 1789, 1790. It wasn't until all of the states ratified the Constitution. Now, the Constitution, as you know, called for a president or a chief executive, and everybody kind of had somebody in mind when that term chief executive got thrown out there. One thing you should know is that people often misconception our founding fathers as this loving group of patriots who were standing linked arm in arm, ready to forge this new country together. And that's just not the case. A lot of the founding fathers actually personally hated each other and disliked each other. But the one person that they all kind of respected was George Washington. So when they had this chief executive in mind, they figured the best way for the public to get behind this president and chief executive is for it to be George Washington. He was a living legend rock star at the time, by far the most popular person in the early United States. That's also why he was made president of the Constitutional Convention, because the founding fathers knew that if the public heard that he was president, they would trust him and they would get behind what was going on there. George Washington really had no interest in being president of the United States. One of the amazing things about George Washington is that he knew his limitations. He's a Virginia planter. He's a military man. He does not know how to govern and, head a country. And he didn't really want any part of this, but the founding fathers, many of them convinced him, look, you need to be the first guy to steady the ship. And he eventually, because he loved his country and wanted to see it succeed, he agreed and did run for the presidency in 1789. Now, he has what are considered the two only unanimous electoral college victories in American history in 1789 and in 1792. If you look at this electoral map in 1789, he picks up all of the electoral votes that were available to the presidential candidate. It's a little bit different back then, though. And if you notice, New York and Rhode Island and North Carolina did not actually cast electoral votes in that election. New York had a dispute between them and their electors and exactly how they were going to vote. Rhode Island and North Carolina actually hadn't ratified the Constitution yet, so they weren't recognized as being a part of this voting process. But back then, electors actually had 2 votes to cast each, and each elector throughout the country casted at least 1 vote for George Washington so that he would win president unanimously, so that he would have the most. And actually, in our Constitution back then, whoever got the second amount of electoral votes would become vice president, and that wound up being John Adams. Was George Washington's vice president, both in 1789 and in 1792. And Adams is famously quoted as saying, vice president is the most useless position in the entire world, which is kind of funny. He kind of sat there twiddling his thumbs for 8 years, do you need me yet? It's kind of like being Aaron Rodgers' backup quarterback, right? Even when Aaron Rodgers, breaks his knee the first play of the game, his backup quarterback's I'm good. I'm healthy. You guys need me to go in here? No, you're just a cyborg human who's going to win this game anyways. And okay, fine. All right. I will continue to stand here with my clipboard. Good luck, Aaron. Ron. So John Adams becomes the vice president. Now, what are some precedents that George Washington sets up? Another amazing thing about George Washington is that he realized that everything he did was going to be a first and was going to be studied and analyzed by history, and future presidents would see, what did Washington do and what can I model myself after? And one of the best qualities about Washington is that he openly admitted that he was not the smartest guy in the world. He only had an education, basically to the grade school level and not much after that. He knew that he didn't know everything, right? So one of the precedents early things that he sets up in the country is to have a cabinet. Now, a president's cabinet is actually not in the Constitution, but Washington thought it was important to have a close group of advisors to help him run the country. And he sets up a cabinet of 4 people. He appoints a Secretary of State, which becomes Thomas Jefferson, basically to handle foreign affairs. He appoints a Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, very famous person nowadays who's, getting increasing popularity because of the hit Broadway show. Again, Hamilton becomes Secretary of Treasury. That's basically to handle the nation's finances and do something that was very important to Washington, and that was try to fight the United States debt right from the get-go. He also appoints a Secretary of War, Henry Knox, to possibly lead any kind of military conflict situation going on with the early country. And then an Attorney General, which helps Washington set up the judiciary system and court system throughout the country, and that's Edmund Randolph of Virginia. He purposely tried to pick people from all over the country at that time, from different backgrounds, to have multiple different perspectives and running the country. And that's something that presidents continue today. We now have 16 presidential cabinet positions. Starts off with just Washington's 4, but like I said, he kind of starts that whole thing. Now, what are some of the main issues in Washington's presidency? And I'll talk about this more as we go on down the road. One of the biggest things that Washington really had to struggle with during his 8 years in office is basically in-house fighting and the rise of political parties. And most of that was led by Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who frankly really just did not get along with each other and had different views on how the country should be run. Washington honestly spent a lot of his time trying to temper those feelings between the two and get them to kind of try to see things eye to eye and not totally throw, the early government into turmoil. Another thing that really plagued George Washington was the fact that many people in the United States wanted us to form an alliance with either Great Britain or France at the time. And this was right in the middle of France's French Revolution going on, where they were overthrowing their monarch, King Louis. And actually, they declared war on all of the monarchies of Europe at the time. And there were a lot of people that felt, hey, France is really a big reason why we even have our independence, why we won the Revolutionary War. We should support them. And there were other people that were like, yeah, even though France helped us during the revolution, we can make a lot more money if we're allies with Great Britain. So let's be allies with them. And Washington was like, no, we're not going to be allies or super tight allies with either of them. He wanted to start a tradition of neutrality, that the United States was not going to get involved in European conflicts. My dog Chance. Was not going to get involved in European conflicts, right? Let's work on ourselves. We're an infant nation right now that is not very strong, and there's no way that we should be getting involved, in France's biddings or in Great Britain's biddings. How about King Louis for a second here, right? Just rewind a few years ago, people are like, hey, let's help the Americans win their revolution against the British. That'll really stick, a thorn in their side. And, one of his advisors had to have been like, well, that could encourage your own people to revolt against you and possibly kill you. Do you think that will happen? And King Louis was like, no, definitely not. Foreshadowing. It did happen. Yeah. So that whole debate about whether or not to support France during the revolution in Great Britain plagued Washington, and he just wanted to stay out of it for a lot of his presidency. Another really interesting story that happened during Washington's presidency, this ambassador named Edmond Genet. He comes over from France, and at first we accept him. And he was trying to travel around the country and go from city to city and convince people why they should support the French in their revolution. And like I said, at first he's totally accepted. Our government's like, fine, you can do that. That's great. Again, Washington's like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to stay neutral, but go ahead, do your thing. And at first Genet is going around and he's like, yeah, you should help out the French. The British are bad. Help us in our revolution against monarchs. Cheers. And people are like, okay, great. And Washington's like, yeah, I'm still neutral. And then after a while, Genet changes his tone to, yeah, your government won't help us out, so let's overthrow your government and get rid of Washington. Cheers. And people are like, that's crossing the line a little bit. George Washington finds out about this. He's like, what the heck? He contacts France and he's like, you need to take your ambassador back. Like, this guy's trying to start a revolution over here. Get him out of here. And France is like, all right, we'll take him back, but just let him know we're going to cut his head off when he gets back here. This is the French Revolution. That's kind of our thing now, right? He's got a guillotine waiting for him. And we're like, yeah, okay, all right, Guinea. We actually let Guinea stay. He stayed in the United States, but we were just kind of like, just go off, be quiet, don't start a revolution because, you got, waiting for you back in France. So yeah, those were some of the main issues in Washington's presidency. But the precedents that he starts of a president having a cabinet, trying to plot and plan all of your moves methodically so that future presidents can kind of watch that. He also tries to set a staunch tradition of neutrality and isolationism, which at times in our history America has adopted, and at times we've abandoned. And both times, that we've either adopted it or abandoned it have been sometimes good, sometimes bad. But Washington at that time, with America not being really stronger on its feet yet, thought we kind of just need to keep to ourselves and work on ourselves. And those are traditions and precedents that he really tried to start. Some events that I left out were the Whiskey Rebellion and his farewell address. I will cover those in future videos on their lonesome because they are super important. Well, there you have it. Those are some of the highlights of Washington's presidency. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, comment, or subscribe. Any of that would be just fine. Please remember that history is life. And in the words of General George Washington, the surest basis for public happiness is knowledge. So go out there and get some. Have a good night, everybody.